The skies were once a symbol of freedom, but now are the home of entities shrouded in mystery and terror. As humanity scrambles for answers and survival, one man experiences the horrifying reality of a world turned upside down. What drives these creatures' hunger for destruction and blood, and where did they come from? Find out as we reveal the terrifying origin of the infected sky. It all began with the plane, a single inconspicuous commercial airliner roaring through the dark of night, heading for Mexico City. The plane was full of unsuspecting passengers. Some slept, others quietly chatted away as the engines roared, unaware of the horrors soon to come.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently at a cruising altitude of 30,000 feet. Please remain seated as we expect some light turbulence with the weather conditions.
Hearing that, Bryan Rogers stirred in his seat uncomfortably. Bryan was one of the passengers on this plane. He had brought with him a portable recorder, which he softly spoke into. He had a sudden urge to record because, in his gut, he felt that something was very wrong.
Audio log entry 14, June 3rd, 1963. There's something wrong with this plane. It just isn't behaving right.
True to Bryan's fears, nothing was well on this doomed flight. A creature had spawned in the depths of the cargo hold, and it hungered. Fleshy, veiny, and armed with dagger-like claws and teeth, the grotesque creature began to tear through the cargo, causing the plane to shake violently. Passengers screamed, and the pilots scrambled to make sense of the situation, because this was no simple turbulence. Bryan held on for dear life in his seat, recording the whole situation.
Entry 16. The plane is shaking, and I think there's some kind of noise coming from below.
Indeed, there was noise coming from below, and to Bryan's horror, it continued to come closer, and closer, and closer, until it was right underneath the aisle adjacent to him.
What?
Other passengers took notice, but it was too late. The floor was ripped apart violently as the terrible creature crawled from the depths of the cargo hold, its jagged teeth ripping passengers to shreds before it consumed them with brutal efficiency. Person after person fell to the beast. The interior cabin began to fall to ruins, neither structure nor human able to withstand the supernatural strength of the monster.
No!
Bryan's fellow passenger was torn to pieces right before him.
Get away from me! Get away!
Bryan ran desperately as the monster's attention turned to him, but soon found himself at the end of the aisle's passage. On a plane, there was no escape from what was inside. As the creature lunged toward him, he dodged out of the way, and its sharp claws sliced down the door to the cockpit. The flimsy material easily gave way, and right before the monster were two fresh bodies, ripe for the killing.
What is that thing?
No! I'm losing control of the plane!
As the creature began to feast on the pilots, Bryan rushed into the lavatory, hoping that the creature wouldn't notice him. But there was another event that Bryan didn't consider. In abandoning the cockpit, no one was left to control the plane. At this moment, the plane began to go into a nosedive. Behind Bryan, the wall exploded, and the man was sucked out into the air, losing consciousness as he began to fall to his doom. Fate wasn't done with him yet, though. When he regained consciousness, he was floating in a pond, hurt but alive. All around him was debris from the plane, and in the distance, a massive fire and blood-curdling screams. The creature was feasting on the survivors.
No. I have to help them!
Before he could act, the earth began to shake. Even in the darkness of the night, Bryan could make out a silhouette of a monstrous creature rising in the distance through the trees. It was enormous, covered in bloody, pulsating flesh, and even had parts of the plane attached to it.
What is that thing? Where did it come from?
As Bryan watched, it roared up into the sky. The creature, now satisfied with its feast, lumbered off into the wilderness, eventually disappearing from Bryan's sight. Free to roam the world, the newly formed creature found its way to the Gulf of Mexico, where it waded into the water and began to journey through the sea. Something was leading it on. Something was driving it to a certain location. And as it lumbered through the crashing waves, it continued to grow in size, its feast of human flesh still fueling it. Where was it going? What was its goal? At the time, no one knew. Meanwhile, for Bryan, survival was just beginning. Lost in the wilderness and witness to a sight of nightmares, Bryan crawled out of the pond. He thought there may be others that were still alive. Surely someone had made it through both the plane crash and the attack. He stumbled towards the remains of the airplane, fighting his way through the thick foliage, every step he took a battle. When he at last broke through the trees to the other side of a clearing, he froze in horror at the sight before him.
What's going on here?
There were heaping mounds of flesh left behind by the creature. The passengers who had survived appeared to be covered in veins and goo, similar to the plane creature. Some had collapsed to the ground, while others coughed and struggled to move. One of the suffering crawled toward him, begging desperately.
Help us! Please, help us!
What happened to you?
It attacked us. It ate so many of us. And then it left. And it left these things around. I started to feel sick just being around it. And then I accidentally fell into one. Please, help me.
Okay, hold still.
As Bryan began to slowly approach the man, a fast-moving shadow darted by in the corner of his eye. He whipped around, trying to spot the source.
Did you see that?
Oh no! No!
Bryan turned around again to find the other passenger shaking.
Get away! Get away! Get away!
What?
In the next moment, the shadow darted out of the trees, lunging for the fallen man. It destroyed him in an instant, shredding him to pieces. And in the light of the fires, Bryan was able to make out its full form. It was blob-like, similar to the mounds that littered the crash site. But atop it was a horrid, muzzled face that gaped wide, rows and rows of deadly teeth lining its edges. The sides of its head were framed by wide, fleshy fins. Slowly, it turned to face Bryan and lunged. Miles away in the Atlantic Ocean, the United States military was scrambling to understand the massive creature they had detected. As it waded through the ocean, nearby ships were dwarfed by its sheer size. Fighter jets screamed across the sky, their forms cutting through the clouds as they approached, sent on a mission to intercept the monster. The pilots were in awe as they beheld the sheer size of their mark.
Command, we have visual on the target.
Copy. Do not engage yet. Observe and report. We need to know more about it.
It turned its large head, eyes shrouded, but unmistakably tracking the machines around it.
It's looking right at us.
Without warning, the creature screeched and reared up, swatting at the planes like flies and sending tremors around the area as its massive limbs crashed into the water. Despite the pilot's evasive maneuvers, the creature's movements were deliberate, purposeful. There was an intelligence to it. With a thundering slam, the beast destroyed the first plane, immediately obliterating both the vehicle and the man inside. Not giving any quarter, the massive beast then turned its attention to the second plane, sending forth a beam of immense power from its gaping maw. In an instant, the blast struck the fighter, prompting a nosedive of death to the waiting ocean depths.
Mayday! Mayday! Going down!
As the last pilot was sent to his doom, the creature shrieked, then sniffed the air around it. Its head turned toward the horizon, and it began to move forward with a renewed vigor. It had found its trail. Meanwhile, things were looking dire for a certain city. In a secure government facility, a team of agents monitored the creature's progress, and the path was clear. It was heading straight for New York City.
First we lose those planes and now this?
A new agent rushed into the room, clearly distraught.
I have urgent news. It seems that this creature is covered with a small degree of radiation. We're able to track it using that signal. But if it gets to any nuclear power plants, that small degree could become large and catastrophic.
This isn't good. We need to evacuate the city as fast as possible.
We only have 15 minutes left before it reaches Brooklyn. Evacuation protocols are in full effect, but with the panic that this has caused, I'm afraid that might be impossible.
Unfortunately for the population of New York, escape was no longer an option. As traffic jams and packed subways caused backups, sirens began to blare, signaling the approach of the creature. It trudged tirelessly onward through the ocean, nearing the shoreline. More planes were deployed and tanks rolled up to the piers, ready to blast at the monster. It labored on, and as it breached the skyline, buildings began to collapse around its hulking form.
This better do something.
The air erupted with the sound of gunfire and explosions. For a moment, it seemed as though the onslaught might slow the beast. But as the smoke cleared, everyone realized the truth. The creature was unharmed.
It's not even scratched.
The creature roared, a sound that shook the city to its core. Then it surged forward. With a single thunderous swipe of its forelegs, it destroyed an entire group of soldiers, smashing them to bits. At last, it had begun its rampage on humanity. At the same time, Bryan, weak and disoriented, stumbled through the wilderness. He was being chased, hunted like a prey animal by the amorphous, fleshy monster that had taken out the other passenger. As he ran, he noticed more of these creatures appearing around the crash site. And soon, the screaming from the humans that had survived died off.
Am I the only one left? No, it can't be.
The fleshy shadows slithered through the foliage, following him closely, closing in on his position. As he passed by a low-hanging tree, he narrowly avoided being the monster's snack as it chomped down on the trunk. It bought him precious seconds, but not much.
Help! If anyone can hear me, please, I need help!
Bryan barely managed to dodge out of the way of another lunge by the ravenous monster, almost meeting his doom in a nearby ravine. As he looked over the edge and weighed his options, the large-mouthed creature stalked him from behind, growing ever closer. As Bryan looked back, he braced himself for the worst. Suddenly, a flamethrower roared out as it forced back the flesh creature. At last, there was a light in the darkness. Bryan had been found. The one wielding the flamethrower, a government agent, stepped forward, offering a hand.
Bryan Rogers.
Yeah, that's me.
Glad to have finally found you. We need your help to stop the creature. Will you join us?
Bryan hesitated. The threat to the world was great, but his fear threatened to overwhelm him. All he wanted to do was run far, far away and never look back. But he remembered his family at home and what might happen to them if he fled. So Bryan agreed, and the agent led him to a waiting helicopter on the edge of the forest. Before boarding, Bryan stopped to give the agent a chilling warning.
It's not natural. It's growing, changing.
Bryan's words sent a chill down the agent's spine. The stakes were high, and if they didn't stop this new threat soon, the world itself would pay the price. Meanwhile, a discovery was being made in the government's top-secret laboratories. A team of scientists was carefully observing a specimen taken from the mounds of flesh left behind by the airplane creature, watching as a man in a hazmat suit poked and prodded at it in an isolated chamber. It looked unnatural and deathly under the harsh lights of the laboratory, and the head scientist regarded the procedure grimly, then checked over his notes. It's alive. Even separated from the creature, the cells are active and replicating. I don't know how long our containment method will last. With no other choice, he called over the general, someone with the authority to do something about the news he was about to deliver. You might want to sit for this.
Whatever it is, give it to me straight. I need answers yesterday.
Very well. The radiation signature matches the samples we recovered from Antarctica. It's Godzilla's flesh.
Are you telling me this thing is related to Godzilla? A kaiju?
Not just related, it's evolving from the same source. It's adapting, growing stronger with every passing hour.
What in God's name do we do about this?
I believe I have an answer for you.
A top-secret agent entered the room and began to explain how they would proceed with this new revelation. It was decided that a new initiative would be created, a global coalition known as the Aviation Complex Industry. Formed of the greatest minds in technology from around the world, it was a matter that should have been celebrated. But there was no time. After the first attack on New York City, intervention was sorely needed. Otherwise, the creature would continue to grow and evolve, becoming a threat to the very planet itself. Time was running out. Unfortunately for the remaining New Yorkers, the event they all feared was becoming a reality. The creature was back and hungrier than ever before. After its initial attack, the creature retreated back into the depths of the ocean, leaving behind a devastated world and ruined city. There had been confusion as to its retreat. Had it eaten enough to fill it? Had something called it back to the ocean? No one knew, but one thing was for certain. It was back, with a hunger for destruction. Chaos erupted as it emerged from the ocean and began its assault anew. Buildings crumbled under its massive form, and the streets were filled with panicked screams as civilians tried to evade it. Others scrambled to find shelter as the creature plowed through the city. But for most, their efforts were fruitless as it wreaked absolute havoc.
Deploy all available units. We need to slow it down immediately, no matter the cost.
The city's defenses, even prepared, were no match for the beast. Desperation began to set in as the creature continued its rampage, toppling skyscrapers and dropping mounds of pus-covered flesh. Soldiers poured out from hiding spots, attempting to shoot it down with guns, but the bullets did nothing to slow its march forward. As it neared a squadron of particularly insistent fighters, it reared up on its hind legs and stomped to the ground, bringing them all down in an instant. It continued forward through barricades and vehicles, moving through them as if they were mere blades of grass.
We need air support now!
Planes flew in to confront the creature, circling around it like insects. It shook its head wildly, trying to shake off the plane's flimsy attempts at bringing it down. And with one fell swoop and stomp of its feet, several of the airplanes were sent careening down to the earth. Another well-placed stomp, and the rest were out. The streets had become rivers of rubble and fire. Amid the destruction, the scant few survivors huddled together in terror, their screams drowned out by the creature's deafening roars. Back at headquarters, the aviation complex industry scrambled to find a way to counter the unstoppable force. The higher authorities all gathered in a conference room to discuss their next move, and this time they had Bryan Rogers with them, the one with the most experience. As the people argued, though, Bryan was at a loss for words, having just discovered the true devastation that had been wrought by this creature.
Can't we use a nuke?
That would mean the lives of millions!
It would be for the greater good.
Even if we wanted to, it would be fruitless. You know what that thing is related to. Any radiation will only serve to make it stronger.
That's right. We have to make sure it doesn't make it to any power plants. Do we understand its motive yet?
That's a negative. We can speculate, but there's still so much we don't know about this thing.
Just send out as many troops as we can then. We have to do something.
Finally, Bryan spoke up, having had enough of their arguing.
I didn't know that had gone for New York. My wife and child are here. There. Does anyone know where they are? Please, tell me you do.
We have not located them as of yet, Mr. Rogers, but...
But what? I can't be here helping you when my family is out there.
We will find them, but first, we need your help. Millions of lives are at stake, and you're the one with the most personal experience. Help us, and we'll help you.
Although Bryan wanted to argue more, he knew there was no use.
All right, I think I have a plan.
More planes, tanks, and soldiers were sent out to the battle, alongside more advanced weapons. This time, they had a better idea of what they were going to do. As several troops distracted the creature, groups of soldiers began to lay out a trap. They carted in hundreds of pounds of TNT and lined the city streets with as many explosives as possible, until the ground was red with it.
Now we lead it here.
The rest of the military evacuated, and a lone brave pilot was sent out. He circled the creature's head, attracting its attention, and nimbly evading its attack. The monster roared in defiance, lifting its massive clawed legs to try to swat at him again. And when the pilot managed to escape, it hissed and took a step, beginning to chase him.
Target locked. Proceeding with the plan.
The pilot led the monster through twists and turns in the city, attempting to disorient it slightly. They still didn't know how intelligent the creature was, and they did not want to make any mistakes. The pilot narrowly escaped a radioactive beam as the beast spewed forth one of its blasts, and then ducked to the final turn, leading the creature exactly where they wanted it. As the monster stepped into the TNT trap, it felt like the world itself exploded. The street blew open, and the monster sunk into the hole that opened up, burying it torso deep, and right into the line of fire of more TNT. The blast continued to go off. The general, stationed nearby, held his breath as he watched the chaos unfold.
This has to work.
Unfortunately, as the blast cleared, the monster appeared through the smoke, hardly a scratch on it. The plan had failed. In the depths of the aviation complex's laboratory, the AC continued to experiment. The air was tense as the scientists attempted to further investigate the creature. As resources were spread thin, even in the laboratory, only a scant few scientists were left. One scientist turned to the other with worry as they read back their findings. Their specimen had had a large increase in size just within the hour, a significant increase from before. The cells were duplicating at an exponential rate, but the true nightmare had just begun. As the scientists argued over their next steps, an urgent alarm blared.
Containment
breach in Sector B. All personnel evacuate immediately.
The facility went into panic immediately, and the hallways were soon filled with fleeing researchers. The lights were flickering ominously as they ran, desperate to escape. In the chaos, though, one of the researchers lagged behind, transfixed by the sight before him. One of his colleagues lay on the ground before him, body already veiny with the infection. There was something wrong with him, though, something that the researcher had not seen before. As the man's body began to twist and change shape, the researcher stepped back in shock, contemplating his escape. Unfortunately for him, it was far too late. At a different facility, the news struck fast. The head scientist collected the information grimly, knowing that the situation was more dire than ever. More news, Agent.
Something good, I hope.
It's the opposite, actually. The scientist went on to explain something bone-chilling. The flesh that they had been experimenting on had infected one of their own. This time, though, instead of dying like the majority of infected victims, the man had transformed. We've classified them as Vitrans. They're no longer human, just extensions of the creature's existence.
My God. At least we now know where they're coming from. I can't believe they used to be people.
Indeed. I would like to call in Bryan Rogers. He's had more experience with them than anyone else, and he survived. Maybe he can provide input. This new discovery only heightened the sense of urgency. With the knowledge that the infected had the chance to transform into monsters, they now had little time to waste. Little did they know, though, that it was already too late. As the creature wreaked havoc and the scientist experimented, a new threat emerged. The AC's fear was becoming reality. What had once been rare was becoming more commonplace. Lumps of flesh left behind by the monster were putting off a warped radiation that infected anyone that it came into contact with, a fact already well known and just as Bryan had encountered in the wilderness. Now, however, the infection was located in one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, meaning the infection spread like a wildfire in dry brush, and the infection itself had all but ceased killing its hosts. Instead, almost every case took hold of its victim and transformed them anew. These transformations were horrifying to behold. They created monsters that were no longer sapient, instead, grotesque beings dubbed Vitrans by the aviation complex industry. Much like their creators, they roamed, driven forward by a primal hunger that was satiated by only one thing: human flesh.
Stay back! Stay away from me!
Entire neighborhoods fell to the infection within hours. Vitrans, lone or in groups, hunted down household after household, overwhelming first responders and tearing through hastily erected barricades. The military did the only thing it could do.
Call in the AC. We need to contain this, now.
As the aviation complex industry's specialized units were deployed, they were able to make a small amount of progress in pushing back the Vitrans. Flamethrowers, fire really, seemed to be the only thing that had a chance at slowing down the fleshy monsters. But for every one destroyed, 2 more took its place.
General, the infection spread is exponential. If we don't contain it soon, it could go global.
The general looked down to the ground mournfully.
Then we'll do what has to be done. Burn it all!
More and more fire was added to the battlefield until it engulfed everything. There was no studying to be done any longer. At the rate things were going, it was worthless. The battle for containment had become a desperate fight for survival. While that went on, a lone figure darted through the streets. Bryan pushed through the chaos of the battlefield, focusing on his one goal: reach home. After providing all the help that he could, he finally decided he needed to do something. Everyone's attention was on the creature, and despite their promise, no one had stopped to help Bryan, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. Around him, the world descended into horrid pandemonium. Streets were clogged with abandoned vehicles and smoldering debris, and screams bounced between the empty buildings, echoing. Suddenly, he heard a noise in the distance.
What was that?
He quickly ducked behind a nearby vehicle and watched as a pack of Vitrans sloshed grossly by. For a heart-stopping moment, they paused, sniffing the air. Bryan held his breath, hoping that they wouldn't notice him. Luckily for Bryan, at that moment, a survivor rushed out into the street, attracting the attention of the Vitrans.
No, get away!
The Vitrans rushed towards the survivor and cornered them. Their distorted cries sent chills down Bryan's spine as he moved on, unwilling to risk exposure, not with how much was at stake.
Stay focused. They're waiting for me. Please, be okay.
As Bryan neared a split in the road, he realized that the path that was faster was crawling with infected. The other path would take him where he needed to go, but it led to a crumbling subway entrance, the opposite of ideal. He knew that there was no way that he would be able to make it past that many infected, so he reluctantly descended into the shadows of the tunnel. It was dark and eerily silent as he walked through. Suddenly, a guttural growl echoed throughout the tunnel. Bryan froze, heart pounding as he realized his worst fear had come true. He wasn't alone. He turned quickly, looking around for the source. After a moment, it was clear it was coming from deeper in the tunnel, and accompanying it was a terrible, oozing, scraping sound, and it was getting louder.
It's coming closer!
Bryan took off running, doing his best to remain as silent as possible. He knew these tunnels and exactly the route he needed to take, but it seemed that so too did the unknown creature. Despite how fast and far Bryan was running, the sound continued to become louder, nearer. Finally, Bryan saw the light at the end of the tunnel, but something was wrong. It looked like most of the exit had collapsed, leaving only small gaps to allow the light to get through.
I'll have to squeeze.
Bryan ran at the wall and looked desperately for the biggest opening. The moment he found it, he leapt for the small crevice, beginning to squeeze his way through. As Bryan made it into the opening, it was not a moment too soon, as sharp teeth snapped down at the air behind him.
I was too close.
Bryan had arrived at a military outpost. There were quick structures and barricades that had been hastily assembled everywhere, and amidst the chaos, Bryan spotted a familiar face. It was the general. A spark of hope lit up in his chest, and he rushed over. He began to beg the man to help him save his family, but the general was reluctant.
Seriously? With everything I've done, you can't help me?
I'm afraid our resources are spread too thin. We can't lose more lives for two people who are likely already dead.
In frustration, Bryan lashed out at the general, punching him. Then, realizing what he'd done, he backed away slowly, then fled the area.
If they won't help me, I'll do it myself!
Bryan quickly raided a nearby supply crate, arming himself with one of the army's flamethrowers. Then he set out, exhausted but determined to find his family, or die trying. As the city around him fell to further ruin, Bryan found himself in a desperate race against time to save his family. He ran through desolate streets, evading Vitrin after Vitrin, and using his flamethrower to combat any that came too close. It was a long and arduous journey, but Bryan at last reached his home, and to his relief, it was still standing. However, the doors and windows were barred, making it difficult to find a way inside. Finally, Bryan was able to break down one of the barricades and forced himself in.
Hello? Anyone?
Bryan began to hesitantly search through the house. The home was silent, unnaturally so. But then, faint sounds began to creep into Bryan's notice. A soft, distorted giggle echoed faintly from upstairs, and Bryan froze, his heart pounding in his chest.
Honey?
There was no response. Bryan slowly began to ascend the staircase, each step feeling like a mountain. Halfway up, he spotted dark, sticky stains on the floor, and he peered at it carefully. It was red.
Is that blood?
At the top of the stairs, the giggle sounded again, followed by the soft thud of footsteps. More urgent than ever, but still with caution, Bryan took a few steps forward and turned towards his child's bedroom. The door was open, and faint, warped whispers drifted out from within.
Sweetheart, are you there? Papa's home!
As he entered through the doorway, he was met with a disheartening sight. The room was a bloody mess, but there was no sign of his wife and child. The man turned back into the hallway, his heart quickening. Then, from downstairs, he heard a faint, warped voice calling his name.
Bryan!
Honey?
Quickly, Bryan rushed downstairs desperately. He followed the sound into the kitchen, where he found more blood. And just like in his child's room, it was a mess. Then, Bryan noticed that the blood formed a trail straight to the basement door.
No, please.
As he descended to the basement, the air felt like it grew colder. Carefully, Bryan approached until he reached the bottom of the stairs, where he froze, met with his nightmare come to life. Standing in the dim light of their basement were two silhouettes. As he peered into the darkness, he realized it was his family. Both were covered in veiny, horrid growths, and their eyes had gone white as they stared listlessly into the distance.
Bryan! It hurts! Papa!
No, this can't be happening!
Help us!
Bryan fell to the ground, grief overtaking him, torn between his love for his family and the need to stop the infection. Bryan was faced with an impossible choice. Did he eliminate them? Did he leave them and hope for a cure? His wife and child slowly began to hobble toward him, and Bryan remained paralyzed.
No! No!
Bryan shakily drew his flamethrower, but he couldn't manage to fire.
There has to be another way! There has to be!
It didn't seem as though there was, though. What used to be Bryan's family lunged at him, their features changed into a monstrous visage. Tales just like Bryan's echoed out in countless cities across the globe. Everyone and everything would soon succumb to the infected sky.